Just a bit of context. This is sort of, all of you know this, but just to remind ourselves that when Nelson Mandela emerged from prison and preached that extraordinary message of peace and reconciliation, I think everybody in the world saw this as a rather exceptional way of dealing with a very, very bitterly divided history of colonial exploitation and racial hatreds. I think the Rainbow Nation idea caught the imagination of a great many people, and the hearings, that explored some of the terrible things that had gone on were clearly a way to emotionally evacuate a lot of what had happened in South Africa, and to try and develop that extraordinary sense of us, which Mandela clearly saw as very, very fundamental. But the reality is, however brilliant that was, and I think none of us underestimate its integrity or its importance, there are still very, very profound tensions in South Africa. Tensions you see as soon as you get off the plane in Johannesburg, for those of you who've been. And they're emerging, I think, in new and extremely challenging ways. And to help us understand what's happening to the sense of us in South Africa, we've got Pravin Gordhan here on Skype. He can't see us, but he can hear us. We've eliminated us visually for him because it improves the quality of the whole experience. He's a very, very highly regarded figure. As we know, we've had one of our dear colleagues from CID say he's a bit of a hero. You missed that, Mr. Gordhan, but you were talked about as a hero by a fellow South African. And until very recently, you were the Minister of Finance in South Africa. You held that position initially from 2009 to 14, and then you came back in 2015. And then 18 days ago, you were sacked, and someone was given your job, someone who didn't appear to have an O-level in maths. And as we know, the rand collapsed, and the economy's been profoundly damaged internationally and internally by that decision. But really, this is our chance to ask you about what the aspiration of the sense of us in South Africa is about and what's been happening. So can you just first talk to us a little bit about the ongoing tensions between you and President Zuma, which we don't assume were personal, we assume they were political, ethical, and ideological?
Well, good afternoon, firstly, to all of you, and it's a great privilege for humble South African from the tip of the African continent to share some thoughts about what is still, I think, a wonderful country, a country with huge prospects before it. And although we are just a 23-year-old democracy, we ourselves have a lot to learn, but I think there's a lot we can teach the world as well in terms of what you described as Mr. Mandela's ambition for this country as a reconciled nation emerging from a very cruel history that we know as apartheid. Secondly, notwithstanding whatever tensions there might be now within the country, a 23-year-old democracy like the South African one has done a remarkable piece of work in lifting the vast majority of South Africans to a new level, lifting millions out of poverty, increasing the size of this economy 2 or 3 times, and changing its fiscal picture in a formidable way in a very short period of time, notwithstanding some of the difficulties that we face right now. So if you take some of the basic human needs that the vast majority of South Africans were deprived of for centuries in South Africa, sanitation, water, education, health, and housing, or what we might call the social wage in broader terms. There's been, on the one hand, a remarkable investment in this area over the years, but secondly, a huge change in the kind of conditions in which people live, notwithstanding a frank admission that we still have a lot to do as a country.
So in terms of the lot to do, and we had schools being burned down by black youths in the Cape, about 9 months ago. I was in South Africa when that was happening. So a lot of the underlying tensions and dilemmas bizarrely echo what happened in apartheid. In terms of what was necessary, the necessary future steps, what was the difference between you and President Zuma about how that should be approached?
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties with the way we portray some of the narratives turns into a kind of individual do you agree or do you disagree thing. And I think what we have here is an instance where I still am a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. The policies of the ANC, which is Mandela's ANC, and the policies of the government are still fairly clear. Firstly, if you talk about the question of us and who us is in South Africa, the Freedom Charter, crafted in 1955, which opens with the line, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, remains an important lodestar as we create every single day a new sense of us, a new sense of common purpose, and a new sense of a national purpose in what we actually try to do. And in that process, you've had various administrations under various government presidents, the most recent in 2009 up to 14, and 2014 up to now under President Zuma. And in the first 5 years as finance minister, we had no difficulties in the way in which we had to steer this economy, and in particular its fiscal capabilities, in a post-recession environment. So South Africa in 2008 and early 2009, prior to what I say Wall Street visiting us rather than us visiting Wall Street, was growing at about 4%, had a budget surplus for the first time in its history. The debt to GDP ratio was below 25%, and the interest payments on our debt was extremely low compared to what we have today. And throughout those 5 years, we had a very common approach as a government and as the ANC, and indeed as a country, together with the business and labor sectors, in terms of how we needed to deal with the post-recession environment. As you know, I then moved away from finance, and when I returned and was asked to do this job in December 2015, after my predecessor, Mr. Nene, was relieved of his responsibility. You can see I'm trying to be more polite. I don't use the word fired.
I know.
I say relieved of the responsibility. I was asked to come in and help to stabilize the situation together with Treasury and the broader government team. And I think in the last year, during the course of 2016, we, as a collective, did a remarkable piece of work. We created a common sense of purpose with business and labor. We worked together through what is called a CEO initiative to create a new level of trust, a new level of cooperation, get concrete projects off the ground where the largely white-dominated business sector reached out to other sectors of society through a small business fund, a current plan that is being worked upon to employ 1 million youths over 3 years through a youth employment service. Hopefully that gets off the ground by the middle of the year as well, is another project. A third is to look at new investment possibilities, where the private sector in South Africa would commit itself to investment within the country. And then the fourth was to ensure that we avert any ratings downgrade to the junk level, so to speak, or sub-investment level, which we successfully navigated during 2016 as a government, business and labor team as well. Regrettably, as you pointed out in the last 2 weeks, I've now been told to move off the position of Minister of Finance. That's created a bit of a difficult situation because we've now had 2 of the ratings agencies move South Africa's ratings to a sub-investment grade. The rand didn't depreciate to the same extent as it did post the Nenegate situation, as we call it, in 2015. But certainly South Africa finds itself in a bit of a difficult spot. I'm optimistic that whilst these were decisions made by the President within the powers assigned to him in the Constitution of South Africa, the public is asking some serious questions about whether these moves were necessary on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to move on and continue to ask the question, how can we work both as individuals and as groups of individuals in civil society, in business and in the labor sectors to get South Africa back on track, notwithstanding the events that have been unfolded.
So sorry to interrupt you, but how would you...
I'm not aware of any personal differences between the President and myself. We know each other from 1974, when he came off Robben Island after serving a 10-year sentence. So there's no personality issues as far as I'm concerned. And I will continue to do what I can as an individual, working with other sectors of society to ensure that we enhance our national interest.
So do you see, as a loyal ANC Executive Board member, any difference now between the philosophy the ANC had about the Rainbow Nation, the sense of us, and what the President is currently developing as an ideology, particularly around economic privilege and race?
Yeah, I think, firstly, there is a regression, if you like, on the question of race. Non-racialism has always been an important foundation stone, as much as non-sexism and democracy is concerned in the African National Congress. And it seems that when we find ourselves, or some of us find ourselves in difficulty, we begin to dilute our commitment to fundamental principles that the Mandela generation had committed itself to, and young activists like myself and others had committed ourselves to as well. So that's the first thing. Secondly, as is happening in many economies around the world, and I'm sure you have many who can give you this narrative from different parts of the world, including the United States itself, you now have a level of consumerism, a level of greed and insatiability, as some would describe it, penetrating our society, which results in rent-seeking and corruption in certain sectors. I think we must be careful not to get the proportionality wrong in this particular case, which is regrettable, because that's not the kind of ANC that our founding fathers, or particularly the Mandela generation, would have seen for South Africa. And there's a very healthy discourse taking place in South Africa right now, involving millions of people across the country, a much bigger middle class that is concerned about where is South Africa going and how does it impact upon their future and their family's future as well. And that's a very healthy sign that our democracy is alive, our democracy is vibrant, and it's a democracy that is engaging more and more citizens in vital questions that are affecting us. What kind of economy do we want? How do we ensure that we have a greater sharing economy than the lopsided economy that we have currently? So whilst our numbers have been good over the past 10 or 20 years, one of the facts that the rest of the world is sometimes not too aware of is that the apartheid character of our economy and the level of exclusion of millions of black South Africans from any meaningful ownership or participatory role in our economy remains the same. And so in the next 5 or 10 years, one of the crucial challenges that my and other the younger generations have to confront, hopefully in a coherent, cohesive and purposeful way, is how do we restructure this economy so that there are indeed more jobs, more young black entrepreneurs, more business owners that come from the black community, and greater levels of participation in every sense of the word, because that's going to be the big challenge that determines the kind of ownership, if you like, in the broader sense of the us that you actually describe. So challenges there are. I think we must be frank about that. But those challenges are not insurmountable if we go back to the basic principles that guided the ANC over the years. And as you know, there's no guarantee that an organization with good foundations 20 years or 30 years or 40 years hence is going to be always the favorite amongst the elected. So there's a very vibrant conversation taking place within and outside of the ANC about how do we actually go back to those sound principles that the Mandela generation left us with, so that the ANC can continue to play its historic role in uniting South Africans, reconciling them, and in reconstructing our society and economy.
You see, I think Jacob Zuma, if he was here, would say his economic philosophy, his philosophy for his country, is exactly aimed at the black excluded. And actually the earlier generations didn't quite understand how intractable that problem would be. How would you respond to that idea of his?
No, I think one of the realizations that all of us have had, if you like, in the recent past, is that the 1990 to 1994 period, the period between the unbanning of the ANC, the early negotiations at CODESA 1 and CODESA 2, the breakdown in the negotiations and the resurrection of those negotiations in 1993, which led to the first democratic elections in April 1994, looked at the question of the democratic or political transition in South Africa in a very effective kind of way. And by 1996 gave us the wonderful constitution and the foundations for a new legal system that ensured basic human rights and other rights that South Africans would enjoy like anybody else in the world, but did not look at the other dimensions, the dimension of reconciliation. Again, Mr. Mandela laid a good foundation for that. And for generations to come, we will have to work on that particular question. And the third element, which didn't get sufficient attention, was the economic element, as you point out. But that the earlier years found South Africans and the ANC in a difficult position because there was a particular ownership pattern in South Africa, which had to be reassured that it would remain in place and not be disrupted by the political changes. But I think that the experiments that we've had with black empowerment, and I see you have the word empowerment in your GEMS program as well, didn't sufficiently restructure the economy to get the levels of participation that we actually require. So where Mr. Zuma and many others would agree today is that we need a new paradigm to work within. And today the world, I'm sure it's in your program as well, is now talking a lot more about inclusive growth, about addressing issues of inequality, which we have in a very extreme form. It's talking about structural reforms. We have them in two senses. In the one, about what we do in relation to regulatory issues, state-owned enterprises, and the issues of delivering on some of the basic infrastructure that we require in this country. But in the second instance, is to rectify the kind of historical structure that our economy has retained even 24 years or 23 years after democracy. And I believe that today we are driving towards common purpose amongst the big business sector, the many sections of small business and black professionals, the trade union movement, and vast sections of civil society and amongst the political parties, that a new formula needs to actually emerge. You can call it radical economic transformation if you like, or economic transformation or restructuring if you like. But the purpose has to be that a new foundation needs to be laid, building on what we've achieved thus far, which will give us a different kind of economy, more enterprising, more inclusive, more dynamic, and one which can take its rightful place both on the African continent and in the globe.
And one final question, because sadly we have to move on, although we're incredibly grateful for your time. This process, this day that we've been having at GEM, has been looking at the idea of iterative learning, of pausing when you've done something and thinking where you need to go next, not rushing into the most obvious. Looking back on the evolution of an incredibly young country, I mean, South Africa is a blink of the eye as South Africa as we know it. What's the biggest lesson you take from the last couple of decades?
One, that human beings have huge potential to meet each other and extend solidarity if they're given half a chance to do so. So I believe that amongst the 55 million people in South Africa, there's a huge amount of goodwill, good sense, and a national purpose that we can tap into. Secondly, that as the rest of the world is also learning, perhaps relearning, that the relationship between political decision-making and economic policy and economic direction is a much closer dynamic that needs to be both watched carefully, but also managed in that iterative way that you are actually describing, so that there's a common purpose that we develop there where the population and the citizens of the country are the main beneficiaries of the way in which we actually unfold an economic program. And thirdly, that values and culture and, if you like, the leadership ethos does matter. And constantly reminding new generations and younger generations in particular about where we come from as an inspiration about what they need to do into the future actually places South Africa in an interesting position given the kind of legacy that the Mandelas and his generation have actually left us. So difficulties there are, as I've said before, but they're not overwhelming. And in the next few years, if we navigate this country carefully, we can realize the potential that the South African populace has within it.
Thank you very, very much. You are marvellously diplomatic, but I think we've all read exactly what you're saying, and we're incredibly grateful for your time. You can only hear us, but we will give you a round of applause. Thank you very much.